Hey, it's Vass here from Aussie Playground, and welcome to another episode of RC Hot Tip. Today we're going to be talking about pillow bowl suspension, how to adjust it, and how to fix it, and what it's all about. And I'm going to show you a couple of ways that you can actually test it out to make sure that it's working correctly. So one of the things that a lot of people tend to find with this type of suspension is that after you've used the car for a while, you can end up with a little bit of a wobble in your wheels. And that's really because the retainers have actually backed out. So to understand exactly what I'm talking about, I'm going to take the wheel off here real quick, and we're going to sort of establish some ground rules on the actual suspension setup itself. So some cars will have this only on the front, like this one here, the Corelli Python, but some will actually have it on the front and rear. For example, my Team Associated Rival has this both front and rear. And once you've adjusted it as well, there's a couple of different ways that you can actually test to see if it's actually set correctly as well, because this is quite important. So in here we have the actual bowl suspension. So the reason why it's called, I don't know why it's called pillow bowl, but it's also known as pivot bowl suspension. And you can see there's a top and bottom bowl there that's inside the actual steering knuckle, and then you have these red retainers that kind of keep it from, wobbling around. But of course, once they get used, you tend to get a little bit of play. Now to adjust that, all you need is a 5mm bit, and you can adjust that accordingly. Now what I normally like to do is when I'm adjusting it, is I'll go until I can feel it tighten, so right there, and then I'll back off about a quarter turn, give or take. And then I'll test it, and I'll show you how to test that in a minute. Now, one of the other things that you need to know is that with the 2.5mm driver, you can actually adjust the camber of this suspension as well. So you can actually put the driver right in there, and you'll see that there's actually a hex. So the actual bowl itself will have a hex, and by turning this clockwise or anti-clockwise, you can adjust the actual camber of the wheel. Now a lot of the times these are set correctly from factory, but if they're not set correctly, or if you want to make some adjustments, that's one way to do it. If you have spokes on the wheels, you don't necessarily need to take the wheel off. I've taken it off here just so obviously I can show you what's going on. So how do we test that we've actually set this correctly? And how do we diagnose if there is any problems with the steering or anything like that? Because one of the most common mistakes that people make is that they over tighten these retainers and jam up the steering. And when you jam up the steering, you're giving more work for the servo. So the servo now has to work harder to turn those wheels. And a lot of the times people will find that the wheels won't center back correctly, because that's really where the servo is at its weakest. It's when it's trying to return back to neutral, when it doesn't have an input. So it kind of sits off a little bit to the side. So having a free steering knuckles, make sure that everything's nice and loose, makes that gives a little bit less work to the servo itself, and allows you to steer the car correctly. So one of the things that we can, one of the ways that we can check to make sure that everything is done right is by removing the servo out of the equation. Because when you're actually moving the wheels, well, the servo is giving you some resistance, so you never really know for sure how free these are. So what I like to do is I'll remove the servo horn, and I'll do this here real quick. And I always take note of, my steering, make sure that it's set straight, so that when I put the servo horn back on, I know that that's how it was. Okay, so now the servo horn's removed, so this should be nice and free, but you can see that it's clearly not. So I've over tightened one of my retainers here a little bit. So this one I know is done right, it feels good, but this one definitely feels like it's a little bit tight. So I'm going to loosen up this top one. I'm going to see how this feels. Well, yeah, that was definitely a bit tight. And there we go. So straight away, I can feel that that has way more play now, and it feels nice and free. Now, if you've got the same suspension set up at the back, obviously you can't test it with steering. There's no steering at the back, or for most cars anyway. So another way that you can test to make sure that it's nice and free is taking the shock out of the equation, because, well, the knuckles need to turn this way, but at the back they need to go up and down just as free. So you remove the shock and make sure that this is, moving around nice and free. If you push the suspension up and it jams up anywhere, you know that those, pivot bowl retainers are too tight. So that feels nice and loose. and that there's no sort of excessive play there. You always like to make sure that, you know, everything's good and feels loose. So now put that servo horn back on. I know that my steering was straight when I took it off, so I just got to go, there we go, screw back on there, and now I can put my wheel back on. And that's it. That is this episode of RC Hot Tip. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Hopefully you got something out of it. And you know, now you know how to set this up and how to diagnose it a little bit. And hopefully you won't make the mistake of over tightening those pillow bowl retainers, because if you do run the risk of burning out your servo. That's it for me, guys. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that thumbs up button. Don't forget to subscribe if you're new. And as always, check out the video description for links to my social media pages, as well as links to previous videos on the Team Co Rally Python. Thank you again, and I'll speak to you next time.